Merciful, Assalamu alaikum. Good evening this evening to this event at Qatar National Library. At the beginning, we would like to wish you Ramadan Kareem, and I would like to apologize because of the technical issue that we had and the delay. Uh, God willing, this is going to be a recorded lecture and it will be available on the website of Qatar National Library. And this lecture is, or translation is available. So the lecturer will speak in Arabic and you can click on the English button in order to get English interpretation, and we will get your questions and answers.
ما يتيسر طبعا الوقت لن يسمح بعض الأسئلة ربما إذا تيسر الوقت في نهاية المحاضرة.
Of course, we will have questions and answers at the end. The title today is Pandemics, Infection, and Precautions in Arab Heritage, an interdisciplinary reading. Dr. Mutaz Al-Khati, Professor of Methodology and Ethics, Hamad bin Khalifa is going to deliver the lecture, and we are celebrating actually
so this is the occasion that is being hosted by Alexo, and this is hosted on an annual basis,
April,
and it continues throughout April, and this is in celebration of Arabic manuscripts. So our slogan is heritage in the age of pandemics. So pandemics, infection, and precautions in Arab heritage and interdisciplinary reading. So we have undertaken this topic in a previous lecture that you can find as part of the videos that we have in our website. Also, there is an article in the different books that we have, and also we have had a book about quarantine in Islam. دكتور معتز الخطيب أستاذ المنهجية والأخلاق بكلية الدراسات الإسلامية بجامعة حمد بن خليفة. So he is a professor of methodology and ethics at the Research Center for Islamic Legislation and Ethics, Kyle, at the College of Islamic Studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University, who is going to give us an interdisciplinary reading of Arab heritage texts on plagues and epidemics. And he has authored so many books, so many articles, and also he writes academically in a specialized field, and also he writes on different social media platforms. And with regard to the topic of this session today, he has authored a number of research papers, articles that tackle different aspects of the coronavirus, the ethical dimension, and how Islam deals with these pandemics. And also, he has the same topic that he taught last year. And also, would like to talk about the Tabayyun periodical that shines light on so many aspects of the lecture that we're going to be hosting tonight. So we have so many books such as Qubul al-Hadith, and also تحقيق كتاب العالي الرتبة, and also كتاب المدخل, and a number of other books. We are honored to have with us Dr. Mutaz Al-Khatib, who is going to talk about this very important theme, which is pandemics, infection, and precautions in Arab heritage and interdisciplinary reading. So, Dr. Mutaz Al-Khatib, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Mr. Mahmoud. I would like to thank the organizers for the the organization of this important seminar. I would like to start very quickly. I would like to apologize for this delay due to technical problems. We were supposed to broadcast this lecture live on Facebook, but due to the technical problem, we're not going to be able to have this lecture on Facebook. So I'm going to talk about the Arabic literatures pertaining to plague literature. So we have so many literatures that talk about this particular problem. I'm going to give a comprehensive view about the writings, and I'm going to refer to particular manuscripts, which are very rich indeed. And the second theme is going to tackle the different problematics, topics in plague literature. So I would like to talk about the central themes that have been discussed in these manuscripts. And the last problem or matter that I would like to talk about is infection and precautions. These are very important indeed, particularly in Islamic heritage. This is a controversy that continued until the 19th century. I'm going to give you a summary of this matter because I have an extended study that is going to be published at the end of this year. So with regard to the first theme, and also in the meantime, I'm going to display to you a number of manuscripts or pages of manuscripts, letters that I would like to talk about. So with regard to the plague literature, I think that the plague was a comprehensive phenomenon in Arabic heritage, and this was tackled in different sources, and we can talk about two sides or two aspects of these writings. So we have some partial writings within a larger framework. So talking about the plague is something that was tackled partially within books that were not dedicated to the explanation of Ta'un or the plague. We have books by Abu Bakr al-Razi, Ibn Sina, that talk about the plague. Also, we have some historical books that talk about incidents that have happened in history. Also, we find references to the plague in some biographies, and also we find references to the plague in Kutub al-Hadith, and so many other references, some such as Ibn Abi Dunya. He had one particular writing that was dedicated to the plague. Also in literature, we find references to the plague in literary books, in Zuhd books, and so on and so forth. And the second thing that I would like to talk about is books that have been dedicated to the plague. The whole book is about the plague. So they have been exclusively talking about the plague. So we talk about these individual books that have a kind of a multidisciplinary kind of book. So these books are not only talking about or talk about the medical parts, we're talking about an interdisciplinary field or interdisciplinary approach. So this is not only limited to the plague from a medical perspective only. No, it is dedicated to an interdisciplinary kind of discussion that tackles the medical side, the jurisprudential side, the historical side, the linguistic side, and so on and so forth. These are different disciplines and fields of study. All of them are included in this kind of specialized writing. So that is why I call them interdisciplinary interdisciplinary literatures. So I would like to mention so many parts of this kind of interdisciplinary discourse. So this reflects that we have this specialization, and it is a specialization that is interdisciplinary. And this was one of the predominant fields in Arab heritage. And it is only limited to the plague, but also other topics as well. So when these topics, they deal with certain specific matters, specific themes, outside the traditional disciplines. So when we talk about al-fiqh or jurisprudence, we know what we're talking about. When we talk about the science of kalam, we know what we're going to talk about. These are writings that are specialized in one discipline. But when we go beyond these disciplines, we find that there are certain themes, topics such as the plague or such as pandemics and so on and so forth. So we'll find here that the topic, the theme is undertaken, is discussed from different disciplines, from an interdisciplinary discourse. So I'd like to give you also
الكتابات المفردة حول الطاعون يمكن أن نصنفها إلى قسمين أو مرحلتين تحديدا. المرحلة الأولى هي الكتابات التي
The first stage is the literature that was written before the Great Plague or the Big Plague in the centuries ago. So this Great Plague or the Big Plague, many historians talked about this plague with different descriptions, and the Europeans, for instance, talked about being the Black Death. So it has many names. The most important thing is that before this plague, there were several writings. Unfortunately, we did not get but a few of them. One of the most famous books about plague before the Great Plague is the book of Abi Dunya, but we do not know where the book is. We cannot find it in any of the libraries. Maybe we can discover in the future, we might discover in the future a copy. It is true that this book is not available, but we know the style of the author at the end of the third Hijri century, and he is quotes the hadith, and of course he collected the plague hadith in this book, and he seldom had any comments and opinions in his books. He used to quote the prophet, and after the big plague, the Great Plague, we see many writings after the Great Plague that start during the era of the plague and then later on in later centuries. And I would like to mention three Andalusian letters mentioning the Black Death. So they were important to examiners in Europe, and also some researchers, modern researchers who studied these letters. For instance, I would like to mention that the first examiner was Michael Bolt in his book The Black Death, and it was also published lately by Dr. Muhammad Hassan in Tunisia under the title of Three Letters from Andalusia. and the letters of Ibn Khatima, the doctor, the physician, in addition to Ibn Khatib, and Ash-Shafquri. So these are the three letters that were written in that era. So not 1 year, but one era. And they have personal links to each other. So Ibn Shakuri is the student of Ibn Khatib, and Ibn Khatib was the friend of Ibn Khatima. So we are talking about one circle of individuals who have connections with each other. Ibn Khatim and Ibn Khatib were interested in several arts and sciences to include medicine. The third is physician, but let us now go through some samples that I am mentioning now in order for you to get an idea about them. For instance, this is Ibn Khatima's. This is the second copy that is clearer than the more widespread copy. It is clearer, but it comes at a later stage. And I have another Moroccan copy, but it is more difficult to read. So for instance, here it is clear that Ibn Khatima, Ibn Khatima here starts talking about the fact that some people asked him about the plague and said, some of my friends
حقيقة هذا الطاعون الظاهر
asked me. So in 749, the year is 749. So it's talking about the great plague. And he was asked to deliver a definition per medicine. And what are the reasons behind the great plague and the infection, and how to protect oneself, and what would be the cure or the treatment, and what about other meanings. For instance, this copy is not accurate, so we have the also question regarding the hadith and some excerpt or verse from the Holy Quran, and he talks about the 10 questions. I hope that I am not speaking too fast for the interpreter. So the questions are dealt with in detail. So Ibn Khatima starts with a medical introduction, and then talks about religious aspects, the Hadith and the Holy Quran, and trying to bring together the Hadith and the medical information. The important feature of the letter of Ibn Khatima, maybe the unique feature, is that he is relying on experience. So experiment. He was an observer. He was observing the plague cases as a medical expert, and he was following up and analyzing. And there was always mentioning of some experiments and also observations. So direct experiments and following up the cases of infected people based on his field of specialty and the information that was available back then. This is how he could prove the fact that plague was infectious and also the immunity. And Salim ibn Khatib proved what today we call immunity or immune response of the body. So this is the first letter. The second letter is the letter of مقنعة سائل of Ibn al-Khatib. So مقنعة سائل of Ibn al-Khatib. This is the letter. So it is a short letter, very short one. So you can see here the plague mentioned, or the great disease. And Ibn Khatima talked about the incoming disease. So the different terminology in Arabic was used here. This is the letter of Ibn al-Khatib. At the beginning, we can see. So we need to identify the true nature of this disease. We can talk about it being, etc. So I will not take much of your time reading manuscripts. So he was also involved in the discussions in Granada and in Andalusia regarding the plague that hit several countries and resulted in the death of thousands of people. Of course, the plague also reached many Arab and Islamic countries. So this letter was written to tackle the medical aspect of the plague, but Ibn al-Khatib is also expanding the research and arguing with people who do not believe or did not believe in the infectious nature of this plague. So this is another copy that I will share with you. It is a clearer copy, and you can see clearly what he is seeing, what he is saying here. So he starts talking about the medical aspects, and he was explaining the disease and how to take precautionary measures. And also he talks about the experiments, the observation, and the news that proved the infectious nature of this disease. So that was proven. And he is talking here about proving the fact that this is an infectious disease through the material that he used, the proof, the evidence. And then he argues and criticizes those people since he was a medical doctor. So he was harsh on the people who deny the infection. Of course, a number of people changed their mind after seeing the numbers of people who got infected. Let us move to the third letter now, which is the letter of Al-Shaquri, the third Andalusian character, and he is the student of Ibn al-Khatib. And you can notice here that Shaquri in this thesis, so we are talking about thesis. And we can see in this thesis the total or the full thesis. I don't know the complete thesis. I do not know where it is. This is a shorter one. So the thesis of Shakuri. So discussing the news regarding the disease. And this is a summary of the original thesis. So it was basically named or entitled Advice, and I do not know who called it so. Uh, so he talked about this in the beginning and linked it with the religion and the fact that the protection of medicine and the use of medical treatment is actually mentioned in the Holy Book. The lecture goes on to read excerpts and it is about the fact that this is to advise people based on the medical knowledge. So it is clear that this thesis is written to help people take precautionary measures from a medical perspective. And this is the objective. That was the objective. And this shows to what extent there was an argument about the infectious nature of this disease. And he was among the people who tried, among the experts who tried to prove the infectious nature of the plague and offering counsel to people. These were quick samples from Andalusia. So once again, please allow me to talk about another thesis. So this is the book of Imam Hafiz ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. So this book was a famous book and it became reference material. This is why we find several quotes even in Morocco, and it was famous among its contemporaries. So Muhammad al-Rasa quotes Ibn Hajar many times and praises Ibn Hajar. So it means that the thesis was actually widespread back then, and it became reference material for several studies in the future. So here we can see the book. Imam Asqalani is actually a well-known figure and needs no introduction. So this thesis is clear, the writing is clear. So here we can see a number of questions by people gathering news about the plague, and they asked to explain it and interpret its meaning. And I pray to God Almighty to help us or help me. And this is among the important books that focuses on the interdisciplinary approach. So here we can see this interdisciplinary approach when it comes to his knowledge and jurisprudence and history and language, in terms of medical information, also presenting arguments and everything that's got to do with the plague, and also the science of discourse, of course. So we find all these things in this thesis. So I will not take much of your time. I will just use this summary. So this thesis, I think he started writing it in 819, and he started working on it, developing it, reviewing it, and he might have completed it 4 years or 6 years before his death. So 880 or 48. So 4 years, because he died in 852. So during this long period of time, he was reviewing his thesis, adding and modifying in order for him to get to this copy. This is one of the many copies of this thesis. It is important to say that he himself was infected. He had the plague, but he recovered quickly. We know that during the era of Ibn Hajar, they had identified 4 types of plague based on the descriptions that were widespread by observation and from a medical standpoint. So he mentions 4 types of plagues. He was hit by one. He lost, I think he lost two daughters, at least one of them. I think actually two of them died because of the plague. And this explains to what extent he was involved in this topic. And also, this topic is dear to him, or was dear to him, and personal to him. So I will be talking about samples. I'll go through samples from Andalusia and also from the east. Hajar was in Egypt, and he was infected as well. So what can we understand out of this analytical reading of all many of these manuscripts? So I do not say that I have, I do not claim to have all of them, but I have many of them. So we find that these theses, especially after the Great Plague, we see a discussion in the thesis, a discussion about the medical practices in that era. Based on several indicators in these theses, we can understand, especially historians are interested in these details, the social practices during the era of the plague. So we have several indicators in order to understand the social practices that were widespread back then. So we see these arguments between the members of a certain community regarding the infectious nature of the plague. And we talked about the criticism of Ibn Khatib that was addressed to people who do not believe in the infectious nature of this plague. And he accused the people of not valuing life. And also there are the naturalists who actually link between natural reasons and the plague. So we have several theses. Ibn Khatima, for instance, was not using a harsh tone, although he was in an indirect argument or debate with these people. And on the other hand, the people who reject the infectious nature of the disease, Suramari and others, Al-Manbiji and others who denied the infectious nature, and they were responding to the other people.
Then I'm going to mention this when it comes to the different quotes about infection. And also I would like to refer to these theses that talk about the controversy of infection and also the importance of treatment in the age of the plague. And also we refer to the quote by Shakuri, who wrote the thesis in order to give a piece of advice to his brothers, the Muslims, that should take into account the means and methodologies of protection and treatment, because this is permissible. So this was the practice at the time. So there were words at the time that said that it is better not to seek treatment because this is mercy from God Almighty, and it is going to lead to martyrdom for the believers, from the good people. So also we have to talk about the manfa'a, the benefit of medicine, and taking into account the importance of treatment. So we find that also in other theses that came after that talk about resorting to treatment, medical treatment, religious kind of ways and means of overcoming the plague, and also to take into account also precautionary measures that are very important indeed. So if you look here, the book that I have before you, من جنة الطاعون by Ilyas al-Yahudi, who was a medical doctor. So we find that there are references to the importance of experiments. And he said that the motivations, or what motivated him to write this thesis, is that he found that there is a possibility to find in treatment for very critical illnesses such as pandemics and plagues and so on and so forth. So he talked about the difficulties that were faced by people. And he said that I clarified in my thesis, and this was a medical thesis about the plague. And he talked about the reasons that lead to being inflicted with the plague, and how to find treatments for the plague. And also, I took into account what was written by the Fudala. So he hoped also that his thesis would be enough for persons that are eager to learn more about salvation, about finding solutions and treatments for the plague. So also we can get to know the history of this thesis and the era in which this medical doctor lived. And he said that what has led him to classify this thesis are two reasons. The first reason is, he said, when I looked at what has happened in our age, and I was scared that a pandemic was coming after, because they used to believe at the time that things can happen after a certain period of time. So they didn't have a clear explanation. So scientifically speaking, there were so many explanations and interpretations. One of those are the medical interpretations. And so they talk about the air corruption, references to air corruption. So air corruption, in their view, was the reason behind the plague and the spread of the plague. So that is why they have looked into the things that happen either before or during the spread of the plague. So this was the idea that was spread at the time, and that was proven to be wrong afterwards. So this is part of his observation. So he observed that there was a linkage between the zalzala and the plague. So he predicted that the plague would be coming afterwards. So this is an explanation of the background of the sentence that I quoted. So the second reason that has led him to write the thesis, he found that the medical doctors at that particular era did not cure the plague at the time. So he said that the doctors did not treat, and I do not have the following page of the thesis. I do not know whether Mr. Mahmoud had a different copy of this thesis. So I do not know what he said after, since the page is not available in the copy that I have. So there are a number of indications in those manuscript that talk about the forms of practices that happened at the time, whether these practices are religious, social, and the polemics and discussions about the ideas that were very much controversial during the age of the plague. So taken into account the different kinds of plagues. So there were series of plagues. Sometimes a plague would be spread in a whole ummah continuously for a long period of time. Some historical studies have said that the fall of the Umayyad dynasty was due to the many plagues that prevailed during that period of time. So this continued up until they realized the reason behind the plague, and then they put an end to it, more or less. So they knew also the treatment of the plague. So all these controversies continued and became part of history. So it gave us an idea how people thought about the plague and the discussions they undertook, scientific discussions, the different interdisciplinary discussions, and also the prophetic tradition linked to the pandemic, to the plague. And there are so many writings in al-fiqh, in the Islamic jurisprudence, that talk about the plague, and that being inflicted with the ta'un or the plague is a mercy, it leads to martyrdom, and so on and so forth. So ta'un or plague was an enigmatic, ambiguous kind of phenomenon. And after that, there were discussions in the different manuscripts that try to detail the difference between the plague and the pandemic before Al-Asqalani and after Al-Asqalani. They discussed the two kind of matters. So I have two quotes in my latest study, and I explain that it is not of importance now, but what I would like to say is that they have given a different dimension when it comes to the plague. And we have found that the discussions that took place as to how to deal with the ta'un or the plague started during the age of the companions of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, may God bless them, and also during the era of Amr bin As, where people, when ta'un spread, they ran away to the mountains. And many told them that this is a mercy from God Almighty. This has led to the death of so many good people. And Al Mu'ad, the family of Mu'ad, died. All of them died as a result of the plague. So I have detailed some of these aspects in articles in Al Jazeera Net. So if you would like to have further details, you can resort to those articles that are published on Al Jazeera Net. So these manuscripts, as I told you, it is very rare that would look into the plague after the big or sweeping plague to have a whole manuscript dedicated to the plague from a medical perspective, because the methodology was interdisciplinary, that would undertake medical aspects and also include the prophetic tradition, the hadith, as Ibn Hajar had said. And sometimes they use these medical sources in order to add more information to prove the meanings that have been included in the prophetic tradition. And in Ibn al-Mibrad, for instance, he has authored a book. It is a thesis that is not known. It is not famous. This is what I would like to say. So I'm referring here to, there are two persons that have Jamal al-Din ibn Yusuf Abd al-Hadi. Ibn Abd al-Hadi is known by the Hanbali school of thought, and also Ibn Mibrad is also a Hanbali. So this thesis, he called it فنون المنون في الوباء والطاعون. So talking about the plague and the pandemic. So in this particular scenario, so I would like to clarify the matter to you here. So talking about the plague and the epidemic, الوباء والطاعون, he said he was not persuaded by the writings on the plague. So he said that that's why I wanted to include some information perhaps that would be beneficial to me and others. So that is why he included 10 chapters. And in the first chapter, he talks about the plague, the what it came from, what people said about the plague. So there are different opinions, different undertakings by different people with regard to the plague in this first chapter or book. Also what the medical doctors have said vis-a-vis the plague, and they talk also about Prophet Muhammad and what he said, and also what the doctor said that was in contradiction with what he said. So there are 3 chapters that he mentioned. He talked about the works of the predecessors of the Sunnah, the prophetic tradition, and also the response by the medical doctors, the evidence that was given, and those who have used both sources. From the standpoints, they found that there was a great tension between medical pieces of information and religious pieces of information in the Islamic scholarship. So the scientific scholarship, Islamic scholarship in those eras, when they tackle the relationship between medicine and the naqal, or the prophetic tradition. So I have explained this tension in detail. So in an article called الطاعون والوباء, the plague and the epidemic, where I explained at great length this tension and the manifestations of these tensions in those writings. That is why I'm not going to refer to these matters. If you would like to have further details, you can have access to it. In the open access, it would be available in the periodical of Tabayyun in the Arabi Center. So these are just quick comments, quick observations with regard to what we can learn from the different manuscripts on the plague, the ta'un. I'm going to move beyond the third theme and move to the fourth theme now. I forgot to mention that the book by Ibn al-Hajar, for instance, was of great interest to so many scholars. It was quoted and also it was also summarized by Sheikh Zakaria al-Ansari. So this is his thesis. It is entitled تحفة الراغبين, and he said, so the provisions of the book by our Sheikh al-Islam al-Asqalani. So Badl al-Ma'un by al-Asqalani was a book that was very famous. So it was difficult for so many students to read. That is why I summarized the book. So he tried to summarize the book in 14 chapters, and he summarized it into a shorter manuscript or shorter thesis. So this is one of the summaries of the book of Ibn al-Hajar. There is another summary by al-Asyuti. So this thesis was also published. So this is ما رآه الواعون في أخبار الطاعون. So he mentioned in the introduction that he summarized the book of Ibn al-Hajar. So he says also that what has happened is that there was an agreement between the two persons that have summarized the book, Zakaria al-Ansari and As-Suyuti. They agreed that there was istitrad, and the third summary is by Muhammad bin Atiq al-Himsi. As you see here in the title, is the same as the title used by al-Asyuti. And he also said that these papers, I have taken them from the different books that were written about At-Ta'un, the plague, and they include most of what had been included in the studies. And I called it خلاصة ما رواه, which is the summary of what he had narrated. So خلاصة ما رآه الواعون. So it is a summary of the different prophetic traditions that have been used in this regard. So this is a general overview about these manuscripts and the importance of these manuscripts. Let me talk about the last theme. I'm going to talk about the infection and the precautionary measures that should be undertaken. So when we talk about infection, and now I would like to concentrate on the infection, contamination. This is a matter that is very important indeed. So there are so many differences in terms of details. So whether we talk about the thesis that have been dedicated to the plague, At-Ta'un, or the remaining books, particularly that explicate the hadith or the prophetic tradition or commentaries. So the commentaries of al-hadith. So in summary, because I would like to clarify clarify the matter, because this is a very large study, so we can talk about three schools of thought when it comes to talks about al-adwa, or two, not three, sorry. So the first one, the first school of thought, it is the school of thoughts that denies infection altogether, that say that there is no infection at all. It does not exist, because they look into the hadith that talk about no infection, meaning that there is no infection. So it is not something that exists. And we find this kind of ideas that prevailed with the Hanabila, some Hanabila, some Muhaddithin. Ibn Khuzaymah, who is a very important Imam, he is a Muhaddith, he denies the existence of infection. Also, Ibn Hajar also is inclined to adopt the same idea. And he said that there is no infection in the thesis that I referred to a while ago. He said that this is what he thinks. And the second kind of view is the one that proves the existence of infection. And to prove that there is infection, how? And here we can differentiate between three kinds of ideas and references as to those who prove the existence of infection. So they differ between each other with regard to the details of infection. So we have the taba'iyin who believe in the act of nature, and they talk about the reasons are natural reasons, and by themselves they impact the situation independently. And there is a consensus amongst scholars who deny it. So medical doctors who are interested in the sciences of Sharia. So this is a source of consensus, such as Muhammad al-Rassah and other scholars said those who say that are not amongst Muslims, because there is no Muslims that would say that. So there aren't any persons amongst Muslims that would say that, because you're talking about an act that is being manifested or carried out, and that is not by God. So they talk about the causal relations is not in the same way, and that the impact or the influence happens as a result of a cause. So there is a causation here, a causal relationship. So it is God that has created this reason, this cause. So this is due to the cause. So Ibn Taymiyyah says this, and Ibn Taymiyyah links this to the Salaf, our forefathers, and also the ones that are against Al-Mu'tazila. The third opinion who have proven the existence of infection. So this is the opinion of most scholars, and this is what is said by Al-Asha'ira, who say that the reasons, the causes are not impactful. So what Ibn Taymiyyah had said, he says that this attribute was given by Allah, by God, but the Ash'arite, they said that this cause does not have any influence either independently or not independently, and the impact happens when the cause happens and not due to the cause. So the relationship between the cause and the impact is a natural one, and the plague is not infectious. So this relationship between the cause and the impact is a normal kind of relationship. This is what the Ash'arites say, and this was the predominant kind of thought or ideas at the time. So this was reflected in the different writings and theses that tackled the issue of ta'un or the plague. So each classified work was impacted by the Kalami school of thought and also was impacted by the different prophetic traditions, the texts, and also the cases of the plague on the ground. So they tried to look into the matter in conformity with the ideas that prevailed or that people believed in at that particular time. As I said, Ibn Khatima and Ibn al-Khatib did not believe in that. Let me explain their ideas in more detail. Can I take an extra 10 minutes, Mr. Mahmoud? Do you have many questions? There aren't many questions. We haven't received any questions. So you can continue. We have half an hour. I'm going to talk about 4 examples, models in the remaining time in order to clarify to you the differences that exist in the matter of infection. So the different examples. So the first one that includes the ideas of Ibn Khatima and Ibn Khatib. And we have the second example by an Andalusi Maliki jurist who was an important reference, and he lived at the same time as Ibn al-Khatib. And the third example or model that is represented by Ibn Ajiba who lived in the 19th century, who is a very famous Sufist. He has authored so many books and commentaries about the Hikam al-Ata'iyya. And he has also authored so many other books as well. So here I would like to clarify the differences of opinions that prevailed when it comes to infection of the plague and infections in general. I would like to talk about the model of Ibn al-Khatib and Ibn Khatima. Ibn al-Khatib and Ibn Khatima, as I told you, have proven the existence of infection as a result of observation, inference, and so on and so forth. These are 2 medical doctors, and they are learned in Islamic jurisprudence and kalam, and they were very much interested in so many sciences. So both of them have proven the existence of infection. So from what I understood, this is based on that. It is based on the causal relationship. So there is a cause and there is the impact of that cause. So this relationship is closer to the second opinion, which is that the causes have an impact. They do not impact independently, but there is a particular trait that exists in those causes, and that is the attribute of God. So there is a quote by Ibn Khatima who talks about the smell that comes from those persons that have been inflicted by the pandemic. So this kind of rotten nature of the plague and linking it to corruption. And Ibn Khatima and Ibn Khatib, they talk about another concept which is very important and that I referred to previously, talking about the act and reaction, action and reaction. So they have proven what is called the reaction. So the cause, so the illness does not come in a complete form. So there are some other natural causes, such as the virus or the plague. The epidemic does not come in a complete form. No. So the human being himself or herself should have a certain kind of reaction in relationship to this cause. So the cause itself is not in itself complete. So the body, the human body, should interact with it, should react to it. So Ibn al-Khatib talks about the readiness or al-infial, the reaction, the interaction with the epidemic. So this is what Ibn al-Khatima calls it al-infial, reaction, interaction. Ibn al-Khatib calls it al-isti'dad, susceptibility or readiness. So if we look, for instance, at Ibn Khatib, what he said here. So he's talking about being ready, being susceptible to get the virus or the plague. I can't remember which page. Let me check. I think it is here. Yes, it's here. He says, فائدة, the benefit. So he says, no, it is not a فائدة. So he says, if it's, so what is al-istidad, readiness, susceptibility, that has been repeated here? And that, so let me, it is not very clear, the text is not very clear, so let me check. So this is the printed text. So if it is said, what does readiness mean? Susceptibility, and that so many talked about when it comes to infection. So it is the conceptualization of something to get ready for it. So he proves the idea of readiness and susceptibility. And also his colleague talked about infial, which is immunity. So it is not enough to have an illness. So we have to prove the infection. Only we can improve it when there is the act, which is the illness, the virus, the cause, and also the reaction of the body of the human being, of persons. And this is what explains something that is very important indeed, that has been studied by Ibn Khatima, who says, why don't we have an infection spread all over? So one of the reasons that have been said by those who deny the existence of an infection as a result of a pandemic or a plague, they say if there is an infection, so that means that a plague would spread in the house and everybody in that household would have the plague. And also the neighboring houses also should have an infection. And this is something that did not happen. So not all persons in the same household used to get the plague. So, and sometimes you would have the whole household being afflicted with the plague, but not the neighboring houses. So these justifications have been used by those who deny infection to say that it is not a constant, it is not something that would happen. So had it been something like that, it would have spread in all households, in all neighboring houses, and so on and so forth.
أنا أترجم صناعية الآن بكونها علمية، بمعنى أنها
So Ibn al-Khatib talks about this goes back to our understanding of our medical knowledge and also the methodology that was used by Ibn Khatib and Ibn Khatima. So this explains why there was no complete spread of the pandemic or the plague. So because Ibn Khatib talks about the reason itself does not come in its complementarity, so there should be readiness from the parts of the human being, from the person. I have so many details in this particular matter. I do not want to cover them all now, but before I conclude, I would like to talk about the second view, Ibn Ajiba, also the third opinion. Ibn Lub, who was a Maliki, Abi Lub, it is very clear that the value that was sought by both Ibn al-Khatib and Ibn Khatimah is the preservation of the soul. As two medical doctors, they want to prove the infection by saying that we have to preserve souls, to preserve lives. Ibn Lub, the great Maliki jurist, he had another value that he was trying to defend. It was an ethical value, which is the preservation of the social fabric. So this preservation of the social fabric and the public interests. Ibn Lub was a Maliki jurist and an Ash'arite also, which means he can prove the infection by this relationship between cause and effect. So he said, if we say that there is an infection, that means that proving it is going to lead to a certain situation of panic. And this is going to lead to the fact that persons are going to fear each other, and we're going to have a problem in the community, and that parents and kids are not going to pay heed to each other. They're not going to take care of their parents. So, and people are going to be left to die alone. And the public interest or the maslaha amma is not going to be manifested. Nobody would be benefiting from the prayer after death because people are going to fear infection, and that is why they're not going to carry out the duties that they are supposed to do. So that is why he used to fear these repercussions. That is why we concentrated on the denial of infection, the impact of the infection, and he concentrated on what is called fard kifaya, or the collective duty or obligation. In one of his fatwas, he said that there should be restrictions to when we talk about the impact of adwa or infection. He says this should not lead to ending the benefits that the sick people should enjoy and benefit from, that there should not be a state of panic in the community. He doesn't want people to fear each other. So the value is al-masalih al-amma, the public interests. So I'd like to conclude with the last model, which is the model of Ibn Ajiba. He had another value, and I try to summarize here. I would like to give you just the main ideas because we do not have enough time. Ibn Ajiba was a Sufist also, and he was very much keen on a very important value, which is the preservation of the belief of persons and also to rely, tawakkul on God Almighty. Ibn Ajiba, so he used to live in Titwan in Morocco, and you know that these old cities, as it is the case in Syria or in Morocco, Damascus, Halab, Titwan, and other Moroccan cities. There are walls that surround the old cities. So it seems that the authorities in Titwan have closed the surrounding walls of the city when a pandemic happened outside the city. And this is the first idea that we underline when it comes to a quarantine. So they did not allow persons to leave the city nor to get into the city. So Ibn Ajiba, who died in 1809, he used to belittle this idea. He was the sarcastic about this idea, saying that by doing so, they would put an end and stop the qadar of God Almighty. And he used to say his friends, or tell his friends, who wants to learn certitude should go to the place where ta'un, where the pandemic, where the plague is, relying on God. And he says that human beings should sit under the qadar of God, what God wants to happen. So that is why they should not prove the impact or the effect of any of those causes, because the actor and the only actor is God Almighty. So this is what he tried to underline when it comes to an absolute belief in the qadar. Thank you very much. And Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. We still have 15 minutes. If there are any questions, we can answer. Thank you very much, Dr. Mutaz Al-Khati, for this very, very valuable lecture and this methodology that we have undertaken, talking about the controversy of infection and precautions. We have the first question. We have a number of questions that we have received. So we're going to choose some of the questions that depending on the remaining time. We have Dr. Sharif Al-Ansari. Thank you, Dr. Mutaz. So the manuscript of Mihna down, and can I get the translation of Ilyas? Yes, go ahead. The second question by Dr. Abdulaziz Al-Idrisi, who is a muhaqqiq of the book about quarantine, Al-Hajr Al-Sahi, and he is asking, is there a study that compares the different plagues in the Islamic books or Islamic books and other kind of cultures, the Indian culture and so on and so forth? Hamid talks about the concept of infection. How did they explain the adwa, the infection from a medical perspective? How did they explain that an infection has happened? So let me answer these questions and then we'll see if we can take more questions. With regard to the first question that was posed by Mr. Sharif, I do not know if this manuscript is published. I haven't had access to a published copy. So with regard to the translation, you can look for it. I have not looked for the translation of this manuscript. The second question, talking about the concept of adwa, infection. So how was the adwa or infection being explained from a medical perspective? So I have the question, it appears here in front of me. So the question about the concept of infection is very important indeed, because I think that the problematic with regard to the opinion of those persons is that there wasn't one concept of infection. So all the discussion that took place is that infection is something that describes the transfer of the disease from one person to another. This was not denied by any person, but they don't call it infection. So the fact that the disease spreads from one person to another, this is a manifestation, but it is not an infection, but an infection talking about the reason, the cause is impactful in itself. So the difference of opinion when it comes to the concept of infection. So there is an imam here. I think it was one of the muhaddithin. I forgot his name. He wrote a book called Mishkat al-Masabih. I forgot the name. I think I referred to him in my study that is going to be published. I completely forgot the name, so. So صاحب المفهم has quoted him, who is from Cordoba. He quoted him saying that he gave more than one meaning when it comes to infection. He said, if we mean by infection the spread of the disease from one body to another, this is something that we can see with our own eyes. So it cannot be denied. We cannot deny the fact that one person has been contaminated by another person. This is something that can be observed. Everybody sees that one person has been contaminated from another person, but they do not call it an infection. So they were looking at the impact, the effect. If the illness happens in the body of Zayd and Amr was sitting next to him, is it necessary for the infection to happen? This is the discussion that took place at the time. That is why they have had three levels or three kind of opinions. So the difference was about the adwa or the infection of the taba'i, which is the effect that happens independently. So there are some traits of the cause that would have an impact without any third component. So the second opinion that talks about these traits, but it is God that leads to the infection. And the third one say that it does not affect. So including any effect would be impacting or would be inimical to the idea of Tawheed, the oneness of God. So the third question, is there a comparative study between the different concepts in different traditions? I do not know whether there is a comprehensive study, as you have mentioned in your question, but there are a number of comparative studies between the different ideas within the Islamic heritage and also in the Middle Ages. So the idea of infection was also denied in Christian circles. In Islam, at least there was a diversity of opinions, but the idea of infection was renounced for religious reasons in the Christian circles. That is why in Europe, they celebrated the thesis of Ibn Khatima because he was one of the early persons that have proven infection and that Muslims were advanced in the understanding and also in diagnosing the plague. Amongst the persons that wrote about the plague, they said that the King of France at the time, he gathered specialized doctors in France. I forgot which city in particular. I mentioned it in my book that was published in a Tabayyun periodical, and he sought their ideas, and they resorted to some religious Islamic studies, and they have translated them. But we have to say there was a complete some inability to find in treatment to the plague. So all the discussions we're talking about the effectiveness of protection, prevention. But when a person is inflicted with ta'un or a plague and it becomes very critical or the situation becomes very critical, there was a consensus that has other scholars as well. Ibn al-Khatib also says the same, who say that if the plague becomes critical, it cannot be treated. It cannot be treated. So all what they did was looking into preventive methods or certain substances that they used to take in order just to alleviate the pain or impact. There was a fourth question. Yes, we have some other questions. I would like to thank you very much for the detailed and meticulous understanding of infection in the different texts. Thank you very much. So how did the Orientalists deal with the opinion of the Muslim jurists vis-a-vis infection?
يعني المقاربات كانت مختلفة.
So the comparison was different. I did not look into so many studies about infection. In particular, one of the studies in English was about the comparison between Ibn Lub and Ibn al-Khatib when it comes to infection, for instance. So this comparison was from the standpoint of the relationship between, or looking at the ethical, moral perspective of these two. I said Ibn Lub and Ibn Khatima, is that what you said? I meant Ibn Lub and Ibn al-Khatib, not Ibn Khatima. So there was a comparison between the two scholars in order to prove that the idea of difference is not as it was understood. It is not a controversy between a person that believes in reason and its importance and another person that believes in a naql, the text. So the difference between the two is a difference about the ethical perspective, the common morality. So both men had an ethical kind of motivation, and the problem is not between reason and text, aql wa naql. No, it doesn't mean that one was a traditional man or a traditionalist, and the first one was a person that resorts to reason, the second one having only a classical kind of perspective. No, this was a central idea. Any other questions? So maybe we'll take one extra question. So what is the relationship between the spread of the plague and people being content with the qadar from God Almighty, and also the relationship of traders and the impact of traders and so on and so forth. So this is a very long question. So I think the problem lied in the fact that there wasn't a detailed or a meticulous description and diagnosis of the plague. So scholars, medical doctors were not able to understand what the plague was and how it moves from one person to another, how contamination happens. Their diagnoses were wrong. So the matter was based on the fact that science was not able to give a meticulous diagnosis and a treatment. When they were unable to that in classical ages, scholars, religious scholars, tried to look into the matter because they have realized that there had a prophetic tradition, a heritage that they have accumulated and gathered. And after that, they started presenting to people and their authority expanded. So there was a conflict between the authority of the medical doctors that have proven not to be effective in the community. They were unable, and also the authority of scholars that expanded due to the fact that the doctors were unable. But in the modern age, the situation changed altogether. And this is what I have explained in my study in the Tabayyan periodical. Last question. So the last question is a long question. We're going to send it to you. So we have put links, the links of التبين periodical and the أخلاق الإسلامية periodical. We'd like to thank you very much for being with us. May God bless you, and we're going to keep communicating. We'd like to thank all the participants, and we would like to apologize for the technical problem that we have faced. So this lecture is going to be ready on our website. So you can go to events and videos of events, so events recordings. So you're going to have access, you can have access to the recording over there. Thank you very much. Thank you.